Am I on? Yep. Okay, I'm good. So, I don't need to say anything else because he did a really good job introing. But I do want to ask the question. So you went around and you asked people how their week was. And I want to see a show of hands if you heard or you said the word busy or some version of that while you were going around doing that. Yep. And if we're honest, so what are we doing here? We got work to do out there, right? So we got to. And what's interesting is that we all feel this, right? It's actually sometimes like a badge of honor. Who wants to say like, yeah, my week's kind of slow. Got an average week, right? Not really a lot going on. We're almost embarrassed to say, I've had a real restful week. I've just been resting a lot and been trusting a lot. Like that, no one wears that badge, right? And it's the culture we're into. I even have to confess that sometimes I watch my oldest son, Wilder, and I'll watch him pick toys or tools over toys in the garage because he wants to work in the garden bed or he wants to work on a project with Dad. And that's great, and I love that he's learned that work ethic, but I don't want the legacy to just be work. I want him to also to know how to rest and enjoy and to take that. And so you say, okay, so how do you do it? How's the Lockman family do it? And in short, we don't really that well. So that's why they nominated me to do this one, public confession. But then also, it's one of those things that when you look at it, I am learning so much in this process as I study this text, and it's calling me to something because I don't want this legacy to just be this. I want more than that. And actually, that's what God wants, too. There's more to this. And really, when I am caught up in this busyness that the world around us is caught up into, I don't really look any different than the world, right? Our busyness inside the church and the busyness in the world around us, that's not what makes us distinct. We all just start to look the same. But what makes us distinct is when we rest in Him and we stop and we trust in Him. So that's what we're going to see today when we look at the text together. And I want to take us back. We're in this series called Live Free, and we're looking at how we can have this rest today. We're looking at how God has set up this order of life of how we can flourish in Him. And so I want to show a picture here of where God's people are. So right now, God's people, when we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, they're at the bottom of that little peninsula there. They're at the bottom on a mountain in the desert. And God's giving them these commandments of how to flourish and to trust Him and to be more like Him. God's taking about 600,000 people out of this land of Egypt. You can see there's this green, fertile land there in Egypt, and He's going to take them out of that land and take them into Canaan, or the promised land, if you heard it before. He's going to take them into that land, but right now they're in the middle of their journey, and they're on this mountain, and God's giving them all this instruction. You may have heard it called the 10 Commandments, and we've studied a few of these. Honor your parents. Do not have any idols before God. Do not take His name in vain. So next, we're looking at the Sabbath commandment. So if you have your Bibles or smartphones, dial it up to Exodus chapter 20, and we'll read the Sabbath commandment this morning. These are the words of God. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner or visitor who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, and then He rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, there's a lot of instruction in this text. Actually, more instruction than the rest of the 10 Commandments. And so, while we will not cover everything today, what we are going to do is we're going to define a couple terms, and then we're going to look at the heart of what God's trying to teach us in this Sabbath commandment. So, we need to define a couple words because words matter. And so let's look at this first word, Sabbath. This is the word, literally means stop. So hear me for a second. God is saying stop. He's saying cease. He's saying take a time of rest. Take an intermission. Take a break. God knows we need breaks. God knows that when we stop our plans and when we stop our activities for just a moment, that's actually what we were made for and how we were made to flourish and thrive in Him. And then the word holy. We look at the word holy. It means to set apart, to make something sacred, distinct, utterly different. And it's an interesting word when we consider our weekly schedules, because is there really any difference between our days? Don't they all just kind of run together sometimes? They all kind of look the same. You've got the same activities, the same work schedule. There's just 7 days to get everything done, and then you just repeat that next week. And you might have even said this before when you're overworked or overscheduled. Out of frustration, you say, is there anything sacred? Is there anything sacred in our week? And the point of this command is that God is asking us to stop and rest in Him, and that every moment of your life is not to accomplish something on your to-do list. It's not to be productive. It's not to get things done. But there must be set a time for God alone, because as we sang, He is a holy God. And there must be time that's set aside just for Him. And He invites us into this word rest. Rest means to settle down and remain, to be quiet. How many of us were very quiet this week? And what's interesting is the context of this reference is after God had created everything, after He had spoken everything into existence in 6 days, and then God settled down and He remained on the earth. So this is really interesting. God's just spoken everything into creation, and now He's like, this is good. And I'm going to stop and I'm going to rest in the goodness that I've just made, and I'm going to settle down and I'm going to remain on the earth, and I'm going to dwell with the earth. He stopped creating and started dwelling. And the God that spoke the universe into existence was quiet. And so when we stop and we quiet our lives, this is no small thing here. When we rest in that moment and we start resting in Him, we are literally setting aside time to do exactly what the God of the universe did at the beginning of time, to rest. So we've got these 3 words, and you may say, okay, that's cool, but I've got a weekend. I've already got 2 days off. And thanks for the tip, but all good. Rest is covered here. But we must understand the context of where God is speaking to His people and the people that are hearing this word. And we cannot overlook where we have the same tendencies of the people of Israel. So you may ask, you saw this picture, right, going from Egypt to Canaan. Where were they at? What was their condition in Egypt? Well, it tells us in Exodus 1 that they were slaves. They had taskmasters over them. They were afflicted with heavy burdens. They built all these buildings for all these store cities for the Pharaoh. They were oppressed. And the more they multiplied, the more they were ruthlessly made to work as slaves. And their lives were bitter and full of hard service. They're physically making bricks and everything, all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So, doesn't appear that they had a day off, right? I don't see that in the text. And what's interesting is that the people that were calling them to work were not taking care of them. Because they were not just slaves physically, but they were also mentally and emotionally. We'll see in Exodus 1:22 just the desperation of where the people were at. Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt, commanded all his people that every son that is born to the Hebrews shall be cast into the Nile. So this is literally taking a child and putting it into the river. So basically, everything was captive, the people of Israel. Everything was captive. Their sons and their future legacy was being thrown into the river to be drowned and devoured by the animals in the river. And this is just how little these people that were their masters were caring for them and taking care of them. How little regard they had for their lives. And the people of Israel couldn't trust their master, and they had no rest. Not physically, not emotionally, not mentally. And they were a mere shadow of what God had made them to become. And the people of Israel had even developed this mindset of slavery. They'd been slaves so long that they had developed this mindset of slavery because it's all they knew. And we see this mindset come up when God makes this incredible proclamation of redemption in Exodus 6. That while they were still slaves in Egypt, God gives them these words. He says, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel. I have remembered my covenant. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God. I will bring you into this land that is showing you this picture of. I will give it to you for possession because I am the Lord. Now imagine they've been slaves, right? The people that they worked for cast their children into the river. So when they hear someone with authority saying words like this, they're so broken that they can't even hear it. As we see in the next words here, it says that when Moses spoke these words to the people of Israel, they did not listen because of their broken spirit and their harsh slavery. And aren't we all kind of the same? Doesn't sin do this to us all? Where it makes the good news of the gospel so hard to hear sometimes? The good news that our lives are not lost, that we are not beyond saving. God has come and he has redeemed, and he wants to continue to break our mindsets of slavery so that we might walk in this freedom, so we might walk in his ways, so we might flourish in his land. And you may ask, how does God do that? Well, first, he takes the people of Israel and he defeats their enemies, the Egyptians. And then he sets them on their way in this desert land, being led by God himself. And then he starts giving them instructions. He starts teaching them to rest and trust in him. And what's really interesting about this commandment we see in Exodus 20 is it says remember. It's the only one of these commandments that kind of throws that word in there. And so you start thinking, what are we remembering here? So I'm glad you asked. We'll see that story. In Exodus 16, God actually teaches his people how to keep the Sabbath before he gives the command. He teaches them. And so in Exodus 16, we see this where they're walking through the wilderness and they start complaining. They start saying, God, there's no food here. If you saw the picture, it's not a good land to grow crops. There's no food there. They start complaining that they're hungry. And again, a lot of us have been set free by the Lord, but it's a process, right? Don't we still have that mindset sometimes when we see that brokenness come out in God's people? They've just seen him save them, but yet they still are complaining that he can't even provide bread. But what we see here is that God hears their grumbling and he answers them. And he says, behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven. The people shall go out and they'll gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they walk in my law or not. And on the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as what they gather daily. So you see God starting to tee something up, starting to set something up. He's showing his people that he's a master that they can trust. He's one that starts to give order to the way they should live and work. And he starts to introduce this new thing called rest. And so we see again in Exodus 16:14 through 15, he gives a little bit more instruction here. And this is the people of God's reaction here. He says, when the dew had gone up and there was on the face of the wilderness a flake-like thing, fine as the frost on the ground. When the people had saw it, they said to one another, what is it? That's actually what the word manna means. It means like, what is it? And I love this picture of God's people standing around in wonder and amazement. And they've never seen this bread before. Actually, no one has seen this bread from heaven. This is a pretty supernatural thing here that God's doing. And I wonder if sometimes we don't look at rest in the same way. We're like, what is that? Because the people of Israel had never seen it. They had been in slavery. They had been in bondage. The God's people had been there for 400 years. So they're like, what is this concept of which you talk about? And if we're honest, we're the same way. We've either never seen rest. Maybe that's where we're at. Or maybe it's been so long that we don't recognize it. And this is where you might push back on me. You might say, yeah, but you don't understand my responsibilities, and you don't understand the activities that I'm already committed to, and this and that and the other. I have these things that have to be done. If I don't do them, no one else will do them, and things will not get done, and this will be lost, and fill in the blank. Right? If you are an overachiever, maybe you have the misfortune of working in sales or finance or manufacturing. Maybe you own your own business. And you have long days where you can't leave the office because your office is at home, so you can't leave it. Maybe you're just a parent who's constantly pushing yourself to do better, to work harder. I want you to hear this encouragement from God about how he's teaching his people that we should work and rest and trust in him. See Exodus 16, 15 through 18. He gives some more instructions here. He says, this bread is the bread that the Lord has given you. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather each one of you, as much as he can eat, and take an omer, which is like a half gallon. Take an omer and gather that much. And so the people of Israel did. And when they gathered, some gathered more and some gathered less. But then they brought it in to measure it. And this is what happened when they started measuring. Some people had gathered a lot because they are really awesome and work really hard. Some people had just gathered a little bit. When they started to measure it, guess what? Everybody had the same. Everybody had their omer, or their half gallon. And we all work hard, and we should. That is a good thing. I'm proud that my son works hard. But you have to understand that when your work is done, it's done. Let it be done. There is enough work in the day, and then move on. We have to trust God in our work and let it be done, and then rest in him. This is something we have to do regularly, not just when we accomplish whatever we're waiting to accomplish. And it brings me to the point where we all learned our work ethic from someone, right? We all have stories. I was fortunate enough to learn my work ethic from both my mom and my dad. My mom is somewhat of a boss lady. And that's not just the many offices that she's held over the years. That's not the people that she's managed. And that is not just how well she has kept our house in order and kept wonderful food on the table. Um, she's special. And my dad, he's one of the handiest men I know. I'm convinced that if he had the right tool, he could do any job. And I had the privilege of working with him over the summers when I was in school. And we had this farm, we had some horses on it, we needed to build some fence this one particular summer. And it's June 30th, so I don't have to tell you it's hot, right? And so we would be out working in these fence rows and building these fences, and it was hot. And we'd be working hard. The ground was hard and dry. And it just seemed like this fence would just never be built. We're just killing ourselves, plowing away at it. You drink water, and it doesn't matter. It's like you've not drank anything at all. And it was funny. We would always take these moments, and we would take a break. We'd get my dad's truck, and we would run some errands. And in this, we would need to go get a supply or a tool or something. There was always a good excuse, right? And we would run by and get that thing. And I can remember always feeling this tension, right? It's not getting any cooler outside. That fence is not getting any more done. Like, we've got to get back and finish this. And I would almost get frustrated with him at sometimes, if I'm confessing. But we would always make a stop. One of these stops would always be by a gas station. We'd get a cold Coca-Cola Classic, a big king-size candy bar, usually like a Fast Break, a Reese's Fast Break or something like that. And it was just this time that as I look back on it, I realized that what he was showing me was that he was not my taskmaster, and I was not his slave. But he was my loving father, and I was his son. And maybe you need to hear that today about your heavenly Father. He is not your taskmaster. He's your Father, and he loves you. You're his son. You're his daughter. You're not a slave. And when we think about what God's going to teach us and how he's going to show us this, because even right now in this moment, we're like, yes. But then we think, how do I get there? I know God's done something, but how do I get there? And we're going to see how he does it, because you can stop and you can trust in him and you can rest in him. And actually, this is the very gift that God gives us that actually changes us as we rest. So then the question becomes, if we look in the people of Israel's story, we say, if they were slaves in Egypt, what was God making them into as he brings them out of Egypt? And so if we look at this, we say, we see that God was making his people into a royal priesthood. And what does that mean? It means that he was making them into a people that would start to show God and show his people and the world around them that God's not a taskmaster, that he's a good and loving Father. He was making his people into a people that would bless and show others what God's like. And this is for everyone. Hear me, church. This is for everyone. This is not just for the leaders. He was making the whole nation into a holy nation to be his people. So every family in here that claims Christ is called to be like him and bless those around him because of him. This is what being a priest means. So once you were a slave and now you're a priest. And it's really interesting that God uses the Sabbath to make this process happen. So I want to show you this in Exodus 31. God makes this claim, and so once I read this as I'm prepping, I'm like, well, okay, I don't realize what I signed up for, but this is right before Moses comes down off this mountain, after he's gone through 11 chapters of text of instruction on how to flourish in God. And God says this to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. Why? Because it's a sign between me and you throughout the generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. Now think about this. In this instruction, God has told people not to murder. He's told people not to steal, not to take his name in vain, not to put anything before him. Honor your parents. But he says, above all of these, keep my Sabbaths. Why? Because that's how I'm going to sanctify you, and that's how I'm going to make you like me. That's the process. So this idea of sanctifying is actually to make something holy. We talked about that word holy earlier, but it's like setting something apart and making something holy. And this is how we, church, will be set apart. This is how we will be holy like our holy God, as we were singing. And this is how God took people out of this land of Egypt, took them into a desert where they had to trust him, and he made this new culture of rest in him. And he broke their mindset of slavery so that they might find freedom in trusting and resting in him. And the way we do that as believers is we stop our work and we start to rest in God's finished work. And how loving and caring is it that this is how God puts his sign on us. It's not because you're the best at whatever. It's not that you're an overachiever or you are good at speaking or teaching or being a good dad. He says, you will be my people, not because of your own independence, not because of your busyness, not because of anything that you've accomplished, but because you stop and you rest in me. That's how you will be my people. And in the same way for the people of Israel, it wasn't just physical rest. Obviously, they weren't making bricks anymore at the whip of the Egyptians. It's not just physical rest for us either. We were all, at one point in time, or are currently now, a slave to sin, in bondage. But Christ has come, and he took on those heavy burdens. He took sin on himself, and he took it all the way to the grave. And then he died. And then he rose again in this new life, and in this new life, he's showing you how to flourish in him. And he's inviting you to come rest in him and to trust in him and to see that he's your father. He's not your taskmaster. And that you are set free so that you might be able to walk in that freedom. And this is the good news of the gospel. And I want to show you again in Exodus 6. These are the words for us to hear today too, church. God has heard. God has remembered. God will bring you out. God will deliver you. God will redeem you. He is faithful to take you. He will be your God. He will bring you into a land. He will give you for a possession because he is the Lord, your God. So, God is inviting you to stop striving and start trusting in him and receive this gift of rest. So what? So how do we live in light of this work and rest command today? And the question for all of us, it's even on your bulletin, how do you regularly rest in God? And this might look different for all of us. We all have different work schedules, stages of life. A lot of people don't have 2 and 4 on your feet, as my father-in-law says. You've got 30 and 40-year-old children on your heart. It might look different for all of us. But I think all of us can learn from these 3 general principles. We have to plan to rest. We have to make a plan for it, because if we don't, it'll fall the wayside of productivity or entertainment or fill in the blank. and just create some rhythms in your family. Family Sabbath Saturdays, or a no productivity night. We're not going to work tonight. I know we own our own business, but we're not going to work tonight. Could be even as simple as just lay out some clothes on Saturday night before church on Sunday. Could just be as simple as that. Just take some work off of your day and put it somewhere else. Plan for it. Plan for a restful morning before we come in together. But then we have to protect the rest. This is the hardest for me because you have to value it. You have to value rest. It must be a priority because there's always something that you could be doing. And this includes protecting rest from ourselves. Because it's not just rest for your good. This is not just, I got to go fill my tank up so I can go pour it out again. That's not what this rest is about. It's not about being more productive. So even if you say, hey, my battery's charged, I know I had that plan, but I'm feeling good. I'm gonna just kind of punt that restful time. But this is rest that you should savor because it's how God is changing. Because he's holy and he's making you into a holy people for him. And then we've got to rest even when our work is not done. Rest in unfinished work. It's the rare occasion that opportunities to rest come alongside great accomplishments. And even so quickly, it fades. The rest God is calling us into is not because we've earned it, not through our work or might, but because rest is what God has made you for and what God has redeemed you for. So you can trust him. And personally, I was thinking, how do I do this? I was hoping that I was going to come up with something or God was going to show me something because I didn't want to just come out here and say all this and say, I don't know how I rest, but go and do it. Good luck. And a couple of weeks ago, I was making breakfast with my boys, and if anybody has young children, we were making breakfast, right? And when we finally got breakfast made, and I hadn't burned too many pancakes, and we sat down, and we were singing together. And I was singing with my boys, and we were just singing. We love to sing old hymns because they just teach us about what God's done, about how we should live in him, and the future hope that we'll have one day in him. And we're singing, and it was just one of those sweet moments when God reminded me, he said, this is how you're resting in me. Because you're not a good singer. You're not accomplishing anything in this moment, but you are trusting in me, and you are savoring this time. And I want to encourage you, and I want to pray that you have eyes to see that. What is it? How is it that you rest and you trust in him? And I want to leave you with one word today. So if you can stand, I'll read this word over you today. If you've heard nothing, hear the words of Christ, your Creator, your Redeemer today. In Matthew 11, 28 through 30, he says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, or take the way I live, the way I work, take my yoke upon me. Why? Because you will learn from me, and I will change you. I will make you like me. And here's his qualifier here, because I am lowly, and I am humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Because God's yoke is easy, and his burden is light. I pray that we have a mighty and restful week this week. If you would like to come up here, some of the elders will be up here to pray for you. Take rest. Savor God. Y'all have a great week.